The cold that morning had a way of making everybody look the same, and that was the only reason Sabrina heard the truth about herself. She'd left the clinic before 8, still queasy, still not sure whether the nausea was the stomach bug going around Desmond's office, or something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Her scarf was wound up to her nose. She had a knit cap pulled low, the ugly gray one Desmond teased her about, and her glasses had fogged the second she stepped into the little coffee place on Delmore Street. So when she slid into a corner booth to wait for her order, hunched over her phone, she was, for all practical purposes, invisible. Nobody in that shop had any idea that the tired woman in the corner was Yvonne's daughter-in-law. The three women 2 tables over certainly didn't. Sabrina wasn't trying to listen. She was scrolling through work emails, half asleep, when one of them said a name that snagged in her ear like a hook. Not her name, exactly. Yvonne's. And then, a beat later, the rest of it. "You know the one Desmond married," the woman was saying. She had a church voice, warm and carrying, the kind of voice that assumed everyone wanted to hear it. "Yvonne says the girl doesn't lift a finger, comes home from that fancy job of hers and sits down like she's a guest in the house." Sabrina went very still. "That's a shame," said the second one. "And after Yvonne took her in too. With Clarence sick and everything. Took her in is right. Yvonne's over there cooking 3 meals a day, cleaning up behind grown people, and this one won't so much as rinse a plate. Won't put a dime toward groceries either, from what I hear. Keeps every penny of that salary for shoes and hair." The third woman clucked her tongue. "Some of these young women. No home training. I told Yvonne, I said, you are too good, you are just too good." Sabrina's coffee came up. The barista called a name that wasn't hers, because she'd given a fake one out of habit, the way she always did, and she took the cup with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and walked back out into the cold without drinking any of it. She sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time. She wasn't a crier. Her mother had raised her, and 2 brothers alone on a home health aide salary in a town outside Charlotte, where you learned early that tears didn't pay the light bill, and Sabrina had carried that into adulthood like a spine. She'd worked her way from a receptionist's desk to a director's office at Meridian, a design-build firm that put up half the medical centers in the county, and she'd done it without ever once letting anybody at that company see her cry. She wasn't about to start over a cup of coffee and 3 women she'd never met, but her hands were shaking, and it took her a second to understand why. It wasn't the insults. She could take insults. It was the specifics. Won't put a dime toward groceries. She gave Yvonne money the first of every month, cash, in an envelope, because Yvonne had made a face once about direct deposit like it was something dirty. Sits down like a guest. She did the cooking almost every night, because Yvonne's cooking was, to put it kindly, a hazard, and because Sabrina genuinely liked to cook, liked the quiet of it after a loud day. Keeps every penny for shoes. She paid the water bill. She paid the internet. She bought Clarence's blood pressure medicine when his coverage lapsed and never said a word about it to anybody. Every single thing those women had repeated was not just unkind, it was backward. It was the exact opposite of what actually happened in that house, and it had traveled far enough and been told often enough that strangers said it like scripture. And it had one source. Sabrina drove home. She did not cry. Somewhere on Route 9, between the gas station and the turn onto their street, the hurt in her chest cooled into something steadier and more useful, and by the time she pulled into the driveway of the brick ranch where she'd been living for 8 months, she wasn't sad anymore. She was thinking. They hadn't planned to live with Desmond's parents. That was the thing nobody in Yvonne's church circle bothered to mention. Sabrina and Desmond had a house of their own, a fixer they'd bought 15 minutes away, and were slowly bringing back to life on weekends, and they'd had every intention of moving into it that spring. Then Clarence had a stroke. It wasn't a huge one, as strokes go. He came out of it with a droop on the left side of his mouth that mostly faded, and a weakness in his left hand that mostly didn't. And the doctors said he needed help at home during recovery, needed someone there, needed not to be climbing stairs or driving or lifting for a good while. Yvonne couldn't do it alone. Desmond was the only one of the 2 kids with any sense or any steadiness. So he and Sabrina had talked about it one night on the back porch of their half-gutted house, and Sabrina had been the one to say it. "We should move in with them. Just till your dad's back on his feet." She'd meant it. She'd liked Clarence from the start, the way you like a quiet man who watches everything and says little, and, when he finally does speak, is usually right. She hadn't done it to score points. She'd done it because it was the decent thing, and because Desmond loved his father, and because she believed you took care of family when family needed taking care of. For 8 months, she'd gotten up early to help Clarence with his exercises before work. She'd cooked, cleaned, paid, bought, driven to appointments, sat in waiting rooms. And in return, her mother-in-law had spent those same 8 months telling anyone who'd hold still that Sabrina was a lazy, selfish, gold-digging girl who did nothing. The why of it wasn't a mystery. Yvonne had never wanted Desmond to marry her. Sabrina had known that from the first dinner, when Yvonne had looked at her the way you look at a stain you're deciding whether to point out. It wasn't about anything Sabrina had done. It was about what she was. Sabrina was direct. She looked people in the eye. She had a good job and opinions and a way of not backing down that Yvonne read in her daughter-in-law as disrespect, even though she'd have called it strength in a son. Yvonne had wanted a soft girl, a small girl, a girl who'd come into the house grateful and stay grateful. And instead her son had brought home a woman who paid her own way and expected to be spoken to like an adult. And Yvonne had never forgiven either of them for it. So she'd done what people like Yvonne do. She'd built a version of Sabrina that was easier to dislike, and she'd handed it out all over town. Sabrina sat in the driveway a while longer. Then she went inside and she started to think about how a person teaches a lesson that actually gets learned. The thing about Yvonne was that she cared, more than almost anything, what other people thought. Her whole self was built on being seen as the long-suffering saint of a difficult family. If Sabrina confronted her directly, told her she'd heard the lies, Yvonne would deny it, cry, turn it around, make herself the wounded party, and by supper time the story going around town would be that the ungrateful daughter-in-law had screamed at a sick woman. No. You couldn't beat Yvonne with the truth said out loud. You had to let the lie collapse under its own weight in front of the exact people Yvonne performed for. That Sunday, Sabrina did something she'd never done in 8 months of living in that house. She did nothing. She slept late on purpose. She got up, made herself a cup of tea and took it out to the porch, and she sat there in her robe and read a paperback while the day got going without her. She did not start the laundry. She did not wipe down the counters Yvonne had left sticky from breakfast. She did not begin the slow, hours-long process of Sunday dinner, which was normally hers. Yvonne noticed. Of course she noticed. She came to the porch door twice and stood there radiating disapproval, arms folded, but she didn't say anything. Because in Yvonne's mind, the housework belonged to Sabrina anyway, and every hour Sabrina let it sit was just more evidence for the case Yvonne was already making all over town. Let her be lazy, Yvonne was thinking. All the better. Around 4, the doorbell rang. Sabrina got up to answer it, unhurried, and when she came back through the living room, she had Miss Charlene with her. Miss Charlene lived 2 doors down, a sharp-eyed retired schoolteacher who missed nothing and forgot less, and who happened to sit in the same pew as the woman from the coffee shop. Sabrina had called her that morning and invited her to Sunday dinner, plain as anything, neighbor to neighbor. Yvonne's face did a complicated thing when she saw who it was. Charlene, she said. Well, what a nice surprise. Sabrina invited me. Miss Charlene beamed, settling herself onto the good sofa. Said y'all always cook such a big Sunday spread and it was a shame for me to eat alone. Wasn't that thoughtful? So thoughtful, Yvonne agreed, and turned to Sabrina with a smile that could have cut glass. Sabrina, honey, you'd better get started in the kitchen. Can't have company and no supper. And here it was. Sabrina looked at her mother-in-law, and she kept her voice pleasant and light, the voice she used with difficult clients at work, and she said, "Oh, I wasn't planning to cook today." The room got quiet. You weren't, Yvonne blinked. What do you mean you weren't planning to cook? Well, Sabrina said, I hear I don't do much around here anyway. I hear you handle all the cooking and cleaning yourself and I just come home and sit down like a guest. She tilted her head, all innocence. I figured I'd stop making you look like a liar and just let everybody see how it really works. Right then Desmond and his father came in from their slow walk around the block. Clarence leaning on his cane, and the timing could not have been worse for Yvonne if Sabrina had scripted it, which in a sense she had. Yvonne's mouth opened and closed. Miss Charlene watched all of it with the serene, terrible patience of a woman who has spent 30 years watching children lie to her face. There was no graceful way out. Yvonne could not admit, in front of the neighborhood's most reliable witness, that she had never cooked a Sunday dinner in her life, that her daughter-in-law did it every week. So she pressed her lips together, and she said tightly, "Fine, I'll do it," and she marched into the kitchen. What followed was, in its way, the most honest hour that house had seen in months. Yvonne could not cook. This was not an opinion. It was a fact as solid as the counter she was banging around. Clarence had eaten her cooking for 35 years the way a man eats his medicine. Since Sabrina moved in, dinners had quietly become edible, then good, and Yvonne had taken the credit for that around town along with everything else. Now, alone at the stove with a guest in the next room and no one to blame, she was lost. Sabrina heard the smoke, heard the muttering, heard a pot lid clatter to the floor. She sat with Miss Charlene and Desmond and made easy conversation and did not lift a finger. Dinner, when it finally came, was a disaster. The chicken was scorched on the outside and pink at the bone. The rice was crunchy. The greens had been salted like Yvonne had a grudge against the salt. Miss Charlene took one polite bite of everything, set her fork down with great care and said, "Isn't this something?" Clarence didn't eat much. He looked, Sabrina thought, embarrassed, and underneath the embarrassment, exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with one bad meal. Desmond, bless him, tried to smooth it over, the way he always tried to smooth everything over. "Mom's a little out of practice. That's all, out of practice." Miss Charlene turned her sharp eyes on Yvonne, and there was nothing cruel in her voice, just a schoolteacher's terrible, gentle clarity. "Now that's funny, Yvonne, because just last week Louise was telling the whole prayer circle how you cook 3 big meals a day over here. 3 big meals a day, all by your lonesome, and this one," a nod at Sabrina, "won't so much as boil water. That's what Louise said. She got it from you." Miss Charlene picked up her water glass. I guess Louise misunderstood. The color went out of Yvonne's face. Nobody said anything for a moment. The scorched chicken sat between them all. And then Sabrina, calm, reached into the pocket of her cardigan and set her phone on the table and pressed play. It was the recording from the coffee shop. She'd started it without quite deciding to, that morning, the reflex of a woman who spent her working life documenting things. And now the 3 church voices filled the dining room, tinny and unmistakable. "Yvonne says the girl doesn't lift a finger, won't put a dime toward groceries, keeps every penny for shoes and hair. I told Yvonne, I said, you are just too good." Sabrina let it play to the end. Then she picked up the phone and put it back in her pocket. "I was at the coffee place on Delmoreview this morning," she said, to the table generally. "Had my scarf up, nobody knew me." She looked at her mother-in-law. "Everything those women said, they got from you. Every word. And every word is a lie, and you know it's a lie, because you're the one who takes my grocery money on the 1st of the month and counts it twice." Yvonne's mouth worked. "I never. That's not. Those women twist everything. Mom." Desmond's voice was low and awful. In 8 months Sabrina had almost never heard him raise it to his mother. He wasn't raising it now. That was what made it awful. "What did you do?" And Clarence, who had said almost nothing all evening, set down his fork and looked at his wife with an expression Sabrina had never seen on him before and said quietly, "Yvonne, that girl bought my heart pills in March when the insurance ran out. You know she did. You were standing right there." Miss Charlene rose, gathered her purse, and thanked them for a very interesting dinner, and let herself out. By Monday afternoon, the correction would be all over the prayer circle and half of Delmore Street, delivered in Miss Charlene's dry, devastating way, and there was nothing Yvonne could do to stop it, because the truth had come out, in front of the one witness whose word nobody doubted. Yvonne sat at that table a long time after everyone else had gotten up. Sabrina almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But if Sabrina thought exposing the lie would end things, she was wrong. And the person who taught her that was Desmond's sister, Shanice. Shanice was 26 and had never in her life finished a thing she started. 2 colleges, a cosmetology program, a stint selling essential oils to everyone she knew until they stopped picking up. She'd been living back home before Clarence's stroke and had simply stayed, drifting from her old room to the couch and back, waiting, in the way she'd always waited, for something to come along and take care of her. And Yvonne, who could see no fault in her daughter, to match the endless faults she saw in her daughter-in-law, enabled every bit of it. A month after the dinner, Shanice announced she'd gotten a job. This was treated in the house like a coronation. Yvonne cooked, badly, to celebrate. And the job, it turned out, was an entry-level administrative position at Meridian. At Sabrina's company. What Shanice did not know, because Sabrina had never once mentioned it, was that Sabrina was the director of operations there. When people asked what she did, Sabrina said she worked at a building company. In the same flat, modest way, she'd always downplayed everything. Partly out of habit, and partly because early on she'd watched Yvonne's eyes when the subject of money came up and decided her business was her own. So the family knew Sabrina had a good job. They did not know she ran 3 departments and sat 2 doors down from the CEO. Shanice found out on a Tuesday. She'd been at Meridian 3 weeks by then, and she was already a problem. Sabrina heard about it the way a director hears about everything, sideways and in fragments. Shanice showed up late. She did her makeup at her desk. She'd been given a simple intake report to compile and had gotten Desmond, who was too soft to say no to his little sister, to secretly do the whole thing for her at the kitchen table one night after work. Her supervisor praised the report. Sabrina knew exactly whose work it was and said nothing, But she quietly made sure Shanice's next assignment was one nobody could ghostwrite. An inventory reconciliation in the records room. Hot, dusty, tedious, unglamorous, and entirely her own. It was during that assignment, sent to hunt down a missing file, that Shanice walked into the executive suite and saw her sister-in-law sitting behind the director's desk with her name on the door. "Why are you working here?" Shanice's voice went high and accusing, as if she'd caught Sabrina doing something wrong. "Why didn't anybody tell me?" Sabrina looked up from her monitor. "It's a work day, Shanice. If it isn't about work, it can wait." That was all. But it was enough to send Shanice home early, and by the time Sabrina got there that evening, the story had already been retold and reshaped for Yvonne, who met her at the door with her arms crossed and grievance all over her face. "You've been a director this whole time," Yvonne said, like it was an offense, "running that whole company. And you put Shanice down in some storage room like a common laborer? You couldn't find your own family a decent position." Sabrina set down her bag. She was tired. She'd had a long day of real problems, contractors and budgets, and a firm permit that had fallen through, and she did not have the patience left over that she usually kept in reserve for this house. "Shanice was hired for an entry-level job," she said, "by a manager who doesn't report to me and doesn't know she's my sister-in-law, which is how it should be. Her assignments are her manager's call, not mine, and she can't do the entry-level work she was hired for. She got Desmond to do her first report. Did she mention that part?" Yvonne waved it away. "She's new. You could help her. You have all that pull. Other families do everything they can to lift their people up, and here you are holding hers down. Are you scared she'll do better than you?" And there it was, the same move as always. Whatever Sabrina did, Yvonne would find the frame that made it selfish. Sabrina had spent 8 months absorbing that. She was done absorbing it. "Shanice is 26, she said, "and she has never held a job longer than 3 months, and it is not because the world keeps holding her down. It's because the second anything gets hard, somebody in this family runs in and does it for her, so she never had to learn that it doesn't stay easy. I'm not going to be the next one. If she wants a career, she can build one the way everybody else does. I'm not going to buy her a title she can't carry." Shanice quit 2 days later. Didn't tell anyone at the office, just stopped showing up, left her supervisor to figure it out, which meant Sabrina heard about it in a mortifying phone call and had to apologize on behalf of a woman she wasn't even related to by blood. Shanice came home and told Yvonne that Sabrina had humiliated her in front of the whole company, and Yvonne, furious, tried to call Sabrina at work to have it out, and Sabrina let it go to voicemail because she was at that moment in a meeting that actually mattered. That was the week the money came apart, too. It had started small and stupid. Weeks earlier, on a rushed morning, Shanice had stood in the doorway of Sabrina and Desmond's room and asked to borrow money, blocking the door until Sabrina, who did not want to fight before work, gave in. "How much?" "1,800. I'll have it back to you in 2 weeks. She'd Venmo'd it. Of course, the 2 weeks came and went. Of course, Shanice never mentioned it again. And when Sabrina brought it up, once gently, Yvonne had jumped in to say she'd cover it herself. Sabrina shouldn't worry her pretty head about it. Family didn't nickel and dime family. Naturally, nothing came. So that month when Sabrina handed over the grocery envelope, she'd taken the 1,800 out of it. And when Yvonne counted the cash twice, the way she always did, and found it short, she frowned and said, "This is wrong. Where's the rest of it?" "Shanice borrowed 1,800 and never paid it back," Sabrina said. "You told me you'd cover it, you didn't. So I covered it, out of this." Borrowing is borrowing. Yvonne's voice climbed. She wanted to know how the household was supposed to run, how she was supposed to feed everyone on what was left. She was still going when Desmond came in from the garage, and she rounded on him, pointing at his wife. "Look at what she's done. Counts out the grocery money like a landlord. How am I supposed to manage on this?" And Desmond, who had spent his whole life managing the space between his mother and everyone else, looked at his mother, and for the second time in a month did not take her side. "Mom," he said, "Shanice borrowed the money. She didn't pay it back. You said you would, and you didn't. Sabrina's right." He rubbed his face. "I'm tired of this. We pay the water, we pay the internet, we buy Dad's medicine. Sabrina cooks dinner every night. And you've been out there telling people she does nothing. I've been letting it go because I didn't want a war in this house while Dad's recovering, but I'm not letting it go anymore." Yvonne looked, for a moment, like she might cry, and then like she might scream, and then she did neither. She turned and went to her room and shut the door, and the house was very quiet. It was that night that Sabrina found out about Clarence. She couldn't sleep. She'd gone down for water around 1 in the morning, and she found her father-in-law sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, a shoebox open in front of him, papers spread across the table. He startled when the light came on and moved to cover them, and then, seeing it was only Sabrina, stopped and let his hands fall. She sat down across from him without asking. That was another thing about Clarence. You didn't push him, you waited, and eventually he'd tell you. The papers were bank statements, loan documents, a second mortgage he'd taken out on the house 2 years back that Yvonne knew nothing about. He told her quietly in the small hours in a voice roughed up on the left side by the stroke. It had been going on for years, every time Shanice's life fell apart. The cosmetology tuition she blew, the car she wrecked and let lapse on insurance, the boyfriend she'd consigned a lease with who vanished, the essential oils inventory that never sold. There had been a hole and Clarence had quietly filled it. He'd emptied most of a retirement account. He'd taken the second mortgage. He'd sold his father's watch and told Yvonne he'd lost it. He'd done it in secret because if Yvonne knew how bad Shanice's situation really was, she'd panic, and because he was ashamed, and because he told himself each time it was the last time. I keep thinking I'm helping her, he said. But I look at her, and she's 26 and she can't do anything, and I did that. Me. Every time I caught her, she never had to feel herself fall. He was quiet a moment. I'm so tired, Sabrina. I have been tired for a long time. I had the stroke and part of me thought, well, at least now I can rest. He didn't look up. That's a terrible thing for a man to think. Sabrina understood then, the exhaustion she'd seen on him at that dinner and hadn't been able to name. It wasn't just the stroke. It was 30 years of being the invisible one, the quiet one, the one who paid and paid and paid and never told anybody, in a house where his wife's love was loud and misdirected, and his daughter took everything and his own name was a footnote. She thought about how easy it would be to be angry at him. He'd hidden a second mortgage, he'd bankrolled the very helplessness she'd just refused to feed. And she found she wasn't. She was just sad. And underneath the sadness, resolved. Does Desmond know? She asked. Nobody knows. Just you now. She thought about it for a while, the two of them sitting there in the kitchen light. Okay, she said. Here's what we're going to do. And you're going to have to trust me. She kept his secret. From Yvonne, from Shanice, even for a time, from Desmond though she'd tell him soon enough. But she made Clarence promise 2 things. No more secret money to Shanice, not $1, not ever again. And he'd let Sabrina help him untangle what he'd done. She ran budgets for a living. It was the one problem in that house she was actually built to solve. Over the following weeks, she sat with his statements at her own kitchen table after work, refinanced what could be refinanced, consolidated the loans, built him a real plan, a slow, honest climb out of the hole. She didn't take $1 of credit for it. She just did it, the way she'd bought the heart pills, the way she did most things. And she stopped, around that time, working so many late nights. She started coming home earlier, and she started, gently, working on Yvonne. Not with confrontation, which she'd learned got nowhere, but with something Yvonne had never once been offered inside her own family. Attention. There was a Saturday cooking class at the community center on Ridge, a cheerful, low-stakes thing run by a woman who'd retired from a restaurant, and Sabrina signed up and asked Yvonne to come with her. Yvonne refused, of course. She wasn't good at cooking, she said, as if that were a reason not to learn rather than the whole point. Sabrina kept asking, not needling, asking patiently week after week, until Yvonne, who could not for the life of her figure out what this daughter-in-law wanted from her, finally came just to make her stop. What happened at that class surprised everyone, Yvonne most of all. There were 4 or 5 other women there around her age, and by the second Saturday Yvonne had made friends, which Sabrina slowly realized her mother-in-law did not actually have, not real ones. She had a church circle she performed for, and she had gossip. But she didn't have anyone she just sat with. Now she did. They chopped and stirred and complained about their husbands and traded recipes, and Yvonne, who had spent her whole life being seen as the saint, got to just be a person who was bad at browning onions and getting a little better every week. She started coming home with things she'd made, and they were, gradually, edible. Then good. One evening Sabrina came in from a normal day to find the table already set, real food on it, and Clarence looking at his wife like he was seeing something he'd forgotten. Sabrina, he said, did you leave work early? How'd you cook all this? I didn't, Sabrina said. Yvonne made it, try it. He tried it. He'd been eating Yvonne's cooking for 35 years, and Sabrina watched his face change, watched him go back for a second bite, watched him say, honestly, that it was good. And Yvonne, who had spent a lifetime being praised for things she hadn't done, sat there and got praised, once, for something she actually had, and something in her face broke open a little. It didn't fix everything at once. There is no such thing. But it was a door. A few nights later, there was a knock on Sabrina's bedroom door, late. When she opened it, Yvonne was standing there in her robe with a look Sabrina had never seen, and it took Yvonne a second to make herself say it. "I know what you did for Clarence," she said, "with the money, the loans. He wouldn't tell me who fixed it, but I knew it wasn't him. He can't work a computer, and it sure wasn't Shanice." She swallowed. "It was you." Sabrina didn't confirm it. She just waited. "You could have told me," Yvonne said. "About the coffee shop, about all of it. You could have made me look like a fool. You had the recording. You had every right." Her voice wavered. "Why didn't you just burn it all down?" "Lord knows I gave you cause." Sabrina thought about how to answer that. "Because I didn't marry Desmond to win against his mother," she said finally. "I married him because I love him, and Clarence's part of him, and I'd rather have a family than be right." She paused. "I needed you to stop lying about me. I didn't need to destroy you to do it. Those aren't the same thing." Yvonne stood in the doorway and cried, then really cried, and Sabrina, after a moment, let her in. Things changed slowly after that, in the undramatic way real things change. Shanice was the hardest. Cut off from the money that had always caught her, she fell, for the first time in her life, and it was ugly for a while. She raged, she blamed everyone. She left and came back twice. But she also, eventually, got a job at a warehouse and kept it, badly at first and then not badly, because nobody was there to do it for her, and rent was real. She met a man named Marlon, steady and unglamorous, who loved her more than he loved being loved back, and they scraped together a life. When their daughter was born, Sabrina and Desmond helped them put a down payment on a little convenience store 2 towns over. Not a handout, a real business. With real books that Sabrina made Shanice learn to read. And, for the first time, Shanice had something that was hers because she'd earned it, and it steadied her the way nothing had. Clarence got his climb out of the hole. He got his rest, too, the real kind. The kind that comes from finally setting a thing down. He and Yvonne, in their 60s, became something they'd never managed to be in their 30s. Gentle with each other. Sabrina watched it happen and understood that a lot of Yvonne's cruelty had been a woman starving for something and pointing at the wrong person, and that once she was fed, by friends, by a skill, by being seen, she had less appetite for the poison. And in the spring, Sabrina and Desmond finally finished their own house and moved into it. 15 minutes away, on a quiet street with good light, the fixer they'd been bringing back to life all along. They'd only ever meant to stay at his parents' a season, and the season had stretched to more than a year. But they left it whole instead of broken, which was more than either of them had dared hope for that first hard night on the porch. Yvonne cried when they packed the last box. Not the performing kind. The other kind. The nausea Sabrina had felt that cold morning in the coffee shop, the morning all of this started, had turned out to be exactly what she'd half suspected and hadn't let herself say. She was further along than she'd realized by the time everything settled, and when her water broke on a Thursday afternoon, Desmond was still 40 minutes out at a job site, and the only person in Sabrina's new kitchen was Yvonne, who'd stopped by with a casserole and stayed to fuss. Yvonne did not fall apart. That was the thing Sabrina would remember. This woman who'd spent years being useless in every way that counted moved, like a person who'd been waiting her whole life to be needed. Grabbing keys and the hospital bag and Sabrina's arm, getting her into the car, talking the whole way in a low, steady stream that Sabrina, breathing through the pain, found she was leaning on. At the hospital, with the waiting room full and the intake slow, Yvonne planted herself at the desk and said, loud enough to turn heads, "You get my daughter seen right now. Do you hear me? My daughter is having her baby and she's in pain and you are going to move." Sabrina heard it through a contraction. My daughter. She'd heard Yvonne say those 2 words 1,000 times about Shanice and never once about her, and she hadn't known, until she heard it, how much she'd wanted to. Something eased in her chest that had nothing to do with the labor. The baby was a boy, healthy, loud, furious at the cold, bright world in the exact way his mother had entered every hard room of her life. Yvonne held him before Sabrina's own mother could get there, and carried him up and down the maternity ward, telling every nurse and stranger that this was her grandson, that her daughter had just given birth to the finest baby in North Carolina. Desmond, arriving breathless, watched his mother and laughed. "There's a woman," he said, "who fought this marriage with everything she had." Yvonne shot him a look, and then unexpectedly, she softened and came and sat on the edge of the bed and took Sabrina's hand in both of hers, the way you hold something you're afraid you might drop. "I was wrong about you," she said. "I was wrong about you for a long time, and I told the whole town I was right, and you never once threw it back in my face." Her eyes were wet. "You had every reason to leave us. I gave you every reason. And instead you stayed and you made us better, every one of us, and I never even said thank you." She pressed Sabrina's hand. Thank you. Let me spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Will you let me do that?" And Sabrina, who did not cry, who had learned in a hard childhood that tears didn't pay the light bill, who had held herself together through insults and lies, and long nights at a kitchen table cleaning up other people's messes, looked at her mother-in-law holding her son, and finally let herself